Good morning and thank you for attending today's news conference. Bonjour et merci d'être présent. My name is Nick DeFalco and I'm the Media Relations Specialist at the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. We're here today to release our investigation report into the Sam McBride dock collision in 2022. The news conference will begin in English, followed by French, and will last approximately 20 minutes. We'll have a question period at the end. We ask that you please mute your cell phones. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour publier notre rapport d'enquête sur la collision avec le quai du traversier à passagers Sam McBride survenu en 2022. La conférence de presse débutera en anglais, suivie du français et durera environ 20 minutes. La présentation sera suivie d'une période de questions. Veuillez s'il vous plaît mettre vos téléphones en mode silencieux. Our panelists today are Kathy Fox, Chair of the TSB, Yoann Marié, TSB Board Member, Étienne Séguin-Bertrand, Investigator in Charge. We'll now begin with the presentation in English. Madam Fox.
Good morning and thank you for joining us. We're here today to issue 3 recommendations to Transport Canada following the 2022 occurrence where the passenger ferry Sam McBride struck the dock at the Jack Layton Ferry Terminal here in Toronto, Ontario, resulting in approximately 20 passengers being injured, 6 of whom were taken to hospital. Our investigation found several safety deficiencies related to passenger safety management and emergency preparedness. I'll now turn things over to the investigator in charge, Étienne, who will explain how the event unfolded and what our investigation found.
Thank you, Kathy. On the afternoon of August 20th, 2022, the Sam McBride departed Centre Island towards Toronto Jack Layton Ferry Terminal with 6 crew members and approximately 910 passengers on board. Earlier that day, the ferry had completed 8 crossings, 6 of which were at full capacity. It was behind schedule, which is not unusual on a busy summer day. Shortly after 5 p.m. local time, the ferry struck the dock while berthing at the terminal, resulting in approximately 20 passengers being injured, mainly from losing their footing and falling. The Sam McBride is a double-ended ferry, meaning that it has propellers at both ends of the vessel. Our analysis of security footage from the voyage determined that the vessel was approaching the dock faster than it had on an earlier trip that day. The footage also showed that only the back-end propeller was turning as it was approaching. Given the vessel's speed and distance from the dock, the reverse thrust provided by the one propeller was not enough to stop the ferry. The investigation found that the City of Toronto did not have written procedures to define a safe approach speed during docking. Instead, decisions around docking speed were left to the discretion of the vessel master, who may have been influenced by operational pressures, such as passenger backlogs or running behind schedule. Following this occurrence, the City of Toronto put in place documented procedures for berthing. When the TSB investigates an occurrence, we look not only at a specific event, but also the circumstances around it. During our investigation, we found several safety deficiencies related to passenger safety management and emergency preparedness. Under the Marine Personnel Regulations, vessels are required to have a safe manning document issued by Transport Canada, which sets out the minimum number of qualified crew members needed to ensure safety in various scenarios. In 2009, Transport Canada evaluated that a minimum of 13 crew members were required for the Sam McBride. However, following a request by the City of Toronto, Transport Canada allowed the ferry to operate with only 6 crew members and without verifying that any mitigation procedures were in place to offset a smaller crew in the event of an emergency. The safe manning document was subsequently renewed every 5 years without revisions or modifications. Our investigation determined that if there had been a fire on board or a need to evacuate the vessel, there would not be enough crew members to effectively respond. Crew members would have to be in 2 places at once. 3 crew members would be assigned to respond to the emergency, leaving only 3 crew members to oversee the management of over 900 passengers and the possible evacuation of all people on board. While thankfully there were few serious injuries reported and the accident happened close to shore, if an emergency had arisen over the course of the voyage, the crew and those on board will not have been properly prepared. The safety issues raised today are not new. Many of these issues have been found in other investigations of Canadian passenger vessels. Following one investigation in particular, the board raised concern about the lack of requirements for infant life jackets, the lack of assessment of passenger evacuation procedures, and a gap in training in passenger safety management. Kathy will now tell you about the 3 recommendations the board is issuing today.
Emergencies usually develop rapidly, and passengers who are unlikely to be familiar with the vessel and its equipment rely on the fast and coordinated actions of the crew to keep them safe. This is why ferry vessel crew members need to have the knowledge and skills related to crowd management and human behavior in emergencies. None of the crew members of the Sam McBride had received such training, and nor were they required to. In 2017, the TSB issued a safety concern about the lack of a requirement for training in passenger safety management for crew members on all vessels carrying more than 12 passengers in sheltered waters, such as rivers, harbors, and small lakes. To date, Transport Canada has yet to implement any requirements for passenger management training to address this concern, leaving crews unprepared to manage passengers in emergency situations. For this reason, the board recommends that Transport Canada implement a requirement for crew members of all passenger vessels, including those on sheltered waters voyages, to complete appropriate training in passenger safety management. Our next recommendation relates to passenger vessel evacuation procedures. We know the importance of conducting realistic emergency drills. Realistic drills require a large number of people acting as passengers and must include the deployment of life-saving equipment to evaluate if the emergency procedures are practical. The investigation found no evidence that an exercise including a large number of people representing the vessel's maximum passenger capacity was ever performed. In 2018, the City of Toronto had conducted an emergency drill involving approximately 50 people who acted as the role of passenger. This was the largest number of people that had been involved in an emergency drill. These drills did not provide an opportunity to confirm if the evacuation procedures would be feasible during a real emergency, when the vessel would be at full capacity. The life-saving equipment regulations require that all passenger vessels have a procedure that outlines how all passengers and crew members will be evacuated from the vessel within 30 minutes of the abandoned ship signal being given. And although this regulatory requirement is in place, Transport Canada has no formal procedure to assess if this requirement is being met. Therefore, the board recommends that Transport Canada implement a formal validation and approval process for passenger vessel evacuation procedures. This occurrence also highlights the need to have an accurate count of passengers. When people were boarding the Sam McBride or other Toronto Island Park ferries, the total number was only estimated using a handheld tally counter, and children, infants, and those who may require extra assistance were not counted separately. Without this information, there is no way to determine whether there is an adequate number of life jackets available and in the appropriate sizes for everyone on board. At the time of the occurrence, the Sam McBride carried 183 child-sized life jackets. The investigation found that on some voyages, there were many more children on board than the number of child-sized life jackets. Estimating isn't good enough. If there's no method to accurately count the passengers as they board a vessel, there's a risk that not all passengers will be accounted for in an emergency. And plus, if a crew does not identify those that require special care or assistance during an emergency, their safety may be compromised. Therefore, the board recommends that Transport Canada implement a process to validate that passenger vessels are keeping an accurate count of all passengers, including a separate count of the number of children and infants on all voyages. The Sam McBride occurrence highlighted the vulnerabilities related to passenger management in ferry operations and the importance that must be put on passenger safety. Ferry passengers aren't safety experts. They rely on vessel operators to bring them from point A to point B safely. However, The responsibility doesn't just fall to vessel owners and crew. Safety is a shared responsibility, and passengers need to pay attention to the safety briefings and follow safety instructions from crews. Furthermore, Transport Canada also needs to ensure that effective regulations are in place and validated so that if and when disaster strikes, passengers are in safe hands. Thank you.
We will now start with the question period. We ask that you use the microphones and that you identify yourself and your media outlet. You may ask one question and one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions.
Thank you, merci. Andrew Brennan, CB24. I guess the first thing is that, une question technique. When you were looking at the propeller, you said you talked about security footage determining that only one of the propellers was in use. Because the Sam McBride is 85 years old, there's been issues with with throttle malfunctioning before. Was it determined in any capacity if the front propeller was working? Or was it just not in use?
So at the time of the occurrence, when they struck the dock, it was not turning, and we can see that from video footage. However, after they struck the dock, they were able to use that propeller to move the vessel away from the dock.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure whether or not it was broken. This is perhaps more for you, Madame Fox, but feel free if anyone else wants to chime in. Etienne, you said twice that this is not the first time you've made some of these recommendations. These concerns are not new. So my question to you, Madame Fox, is why do you seemingly have to repeat yourself and have recommendations about seemingly obvious things having to be said more than once?
We have made recommendations in the past specifically related to training for passenger safety management during emergencies, as well as for passenger counting. And in fact, as a result of a previous ferry occurrence back in 2006 involving the Queen of the North on the west coast of Vancouver. And at the time, Transport Canada took action, and so we were able to close those recommendations. Subsequently, we've seen a number of other occurrences involving passenger vessels, including ferries, and we've issued several concerns, again, touching on the same issues. And now here again, with the Sam McBride, we see the similar issues recurring. So that's why the board felt it important to issue new recommendations, because whatever actions that were taken in the past are not being applied consistently across the country, and more needs to be done to ensure that vessels like the Sam McBride and others across the country do take more steps to reduce the risk to passengers in the event of an emergency on board.
Good morning. My name is Francine Copen from the Toronto Star. I have two related questions. At one point in the report, you mentioned that the pilot or captain was traveling at 5 knots, which is 2 knots faster than the typical docking speed. I'm wondering if you could translate knots into a reference that people who don't boat would understand. Is that like going 50 kilometers an hour in a 30 kilometer an hour zone? I mean, what is the speed differential there, and was it significant?
So an approach at 5 knot is equivalent to, if I'm not mistaken, 9.2 kilometers an hour, where at 3 knots is closer to 5.5 kilometers an hour. The proportional increase is fairly significant, yes.
Okay, so in light of the fact that the pilot was going too fast, which seems to have been the problem that day, right? There was no equipment malfunction, so it seems that the pilot was going too fast. How come you didn't issue any recommendations to the city regarding pilot training?
Well, first of all, maybe you can address the issue, and then I'll talk about the issue about recommendations.
Yes. So while we did not find evidence that there was a malfunction with the engine or the engine control system at that point, we can't say conclusively that there wasn't one. So there may have been an engine malfunction still during the approach.
And in any occurrence, we look at what actions have been taken by the operator, by the industry, by the regulator as a result of the occurrence. In this case, what we found was that there were no written procedures at the time of the occurrence, and that approach speed was left up to the discretion of masters. Since then, the City of Toronto has implemented written procedures for all of the masters on all of the ferries with respect to safe approach speed. and other birthing procedures.
Forgive me, but I'm confused now because I thought the report said there was no equipment malfunction, and now you've said you haven't ruled out an equipment malfunction?
That's the finding, all the finding says is that the forward propeller was not in use. If you go through the details of the report, when the crew applied the throttle, because in previous crossings that day, both propellers, both forward and rear propellers had been used. But on this particular one, when the crew applied it, the engine didn't respond. And that's why we say it wasn't in use, because subsequently it was able to be used to maneuver the vessel to the other dock, and also the sea trials that were done afterwards did not reveal any malfunction. But as Etienne, the investigator in charge, said, that doesn't mean that there wasn't one at the time.
Matthew Bingley with Global News. I just wanted maybe just a bit of a two-part question here. When it comes to your findings, as you mentioned the fact that staff procedures have been implemented since, like even before this came out. Have you been communicating with Transport Canada as you've been going along to try to maybe move that along? Because about a month ago, I believe, Transport Canada told the city they needed to increase the number of staff members on board, and I'm wondering if that came from this investigation.
So as part of this investigation, we did communicate with the City of Toronto, and we also issued a safety letter to the City of Toronto and Transport Canada, subsequent to which Transport Canada has revised the safe manning document for the Sam McBride, and they now require the vessel to have a crew of 13 persons at full capacity.
I would also add, if I could, that the decision to increase the minimum safe manning for the vessel actually occurred back in, I think, December of 2023. Subsequent to that, the Transport Canada, or rather the City of Toronto, appealed that, which they have the right to do, and that appeal went to the Marine Technical Review Board, and the decision of the Marine Technical Review Board was to maintain the revised safe manning of 13 versus the previous 6. And it's that decision that was just issued about a month ago.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, the appeal, so you're basically saying that that appeal was just baseless and there's no way that they could have operated these under the safe recommendations that you're stipulating for the operation?
Well, what we're saying is that back in 2008, 2009, when Transport Canada initially issued the safe manning document, they called for initially a minimum of 12. That was appealed by the city. They went to 13. Subsequently, for reasons that are not clear to us but would be better addressed to Transport Canada accepted that the city operate with 6 crew members on the Sam McBride. Following this occurrence, Transport Canada directed the city to increase the minimum manning to 13. The city appealed that, and it's the Marine Technical Review Board, which is part of Transport Canada, that decided, no, they have to stay with the 13. There is an exception. They can reduce, I believe, to 9 in the event of, but they have to reduce the complement, the passenger capacity, to 450 in that case.
Bonjour, Mirna Djukic pour Radio-Canada. Par rapport aux 3 recommandations qui ont été formulées, je me demande si vous pensez, si elles étaient mises en application, si ça aurait changé quoi que ce soit à l'issue de l'accident à l'origine de l'enquête.
Les 3 recommandations qu'on émet aujourd'hui, donc les lacunes de sécurité qui sont liées aux 3 recommandations qu'on émet aujourd'hui, ne sont pas des éléments qui ont contribué directement à l'accident. Les éléments qui ont contribué directement à l'accident ont été relatés par Étienne un petit peu plus tôt. Les 3 recommandations viennent d'éléments qui sont ressortis en parallèle à l'enquête. Donc, quand on a commencé à parler aux gens, puis à éplucher les documents, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait des enjeux au niveau de la formation de l'équipage, au niveau des procédures d'évacuation, puis au niveau du décompte des passagers. Donc, c'est des éléments parallèles. Et puis, ces recommandations-là sont applicables au Sam McBride, mais ils peuvent aussi être applicables à plusieurs autres opérateurs de traversiers qui peuvent avoir des enjeux similaires à ça.
Et justement, par rapport à la recommandation 2 là, sur la formation du personnel, si je comprends bien, ça fait écho à une préoccupation que vous avez déjà soulevée en 2017. Est-ce que c'était une recommandation formelle à ce moment-là? Si vous pouvez nous donner un peu de contexte sur ça.
Si vous parlez de la formation sur la gestion de la sécurité des passagers, c'était une préoccupation de mémoire qu'on avait émise à ce moment-là. C'est une préoccupation qu'on avait émise. Et puis, il n'y a pas grand-chose qui a bougé au niveau de Transport Canada. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, qu'on arrive avec vraiment une recommandation formelle pour essayer que les exigences soient améliorées.
Est-ce que c'était dans le cadre d'une enquête sur un accident que vous avez émis cette préoccupation? Ou...
Si je peut-être peux juste rajouter, oui, c'était lors d'une enquête qu'on a faite à Kingston concernant une vol touristique, pas une vol, mais une croisière touristique. Suite à ça, on a émis une préoccupation. La différence, c'est qu'une préoccupation, c'est simplement de souligner à l'industrie et à l'organisme de réglementation qu'on a une préoccupation, mais ça n'a pas la même force qu'une recommandation. Lorsqu'on émet une recommandation, celle-ci au ministre des Transports, le ministre doit nous répondre en dans de 90 jours sur les actions que le département va prendre et ensuite le bureau va évaluer la réponse, à savoir si ça va adresser la lacune de sécurité qu'on a identifiée.
Good morning, Momin Qureshi, 680 News Radio. I don't know if through your investigation or maybe through your experience, you can address this question, but the ferries that run in the City of Toronto fleet are fairly old. They're in the process of replacing them. So is it normal and safe for ferries of that age to continue running in the capacity that they run on those types of, frequent daily trips with hundreds of people on board?
Yes, so vessel's age, as long as it's well maintained and properly operated, we have no issue with a vessel continuing to operate.
And in this case, were they properly maintained?
So in the course of the investigation, we looked at the Sam McBride. We didn't look at the entire fleet, and we found that the Sam McBride we found no issues with the maintenance of the Sam McBride.
Just had a follow-up question. A couple times now you've mentioned Transport Canada. You'll have to ask Transport Canada about a number of things. Is there a disconnect between your organization and it when it comes to, implementing safe recommendations and operation of vessels like these and them not necessarily following through?
So first of all, what I was referring to specifically was the rationale for the decision back in 2009 to allow the Sam McBride to operate with 6 crew versus the 13, which they had determined as the minimum safe manning. We don't have the exact rationale that was used, and for that you would have to discuss that with Transport Canada. The TSB is an independent federal agency. We report to Parliament through the President of the King's Privy Council. We're independent of Transport Canada. We can make non-binding recommendations, and under our legislation, federal ministers are required to respond within 90 days as to what action they're going to take. By and large, they do respond to our recommendations over time, and in this case, although we had made a couple of recommendations touching on some of these issues in the past, and they had been addressed, what we found is that the application has been inconsistent, not just in this occurrence, but in others, and that's why we are issuing these similar recommendations again, and we are optimistic that Transport will take another look at this, particularly as there have been a number of other occurrences. In fact, we've issued 15 investigations, now plus this one, 16, since 1997, where the same issues have been recurring. And so that's indicative that more action needs to be taken by the regulator.
And just one last question on the actual operation of the Sam McBride. The speed factor here, to the average person who's never operated a vessel of this size, is there some sort of speedometer when it comes to this, or is it mainly done by feel when it comes to those who are operating it?
So they do have a GPS indicator for speed over ground and a speed log that is available to the master to determine the vessel speed while he's approaching.
Since you'd mentioned, Chris Glover with CBC News, and since you'd mentioned that the pilot or the captain was going fairly significantly faster than they should have been, is there any kind of penalty for that? I mean, we get speeding tickets if we're driving too fast on the road. Is there any sort of disciplinary action that whoever was operating the ferry would have faced as a result of going too fast?
Well, again, I think it's important to put this in context. As we indicated at the time of the occurrence, the City of Toronto had not provided any written procedures to the crews in terms of speeds related to safe docking procedures. It was entirely left to the master's discretion to determine what was the safe speed to operate. So in answering your question, there was no speed limit per se that was applicable. And if you look at the earlier occurrences, the earlier crossings, that vessel had used a slower speed than that particular crossing. Since then, the City of Toronto has provided more guidance to masters, written procedures to masters with respect to safe berthing techniques. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the speed could also vary depending on vessel characteristics, depending on the environment, the winds, the currents, et cetera.
Is there now a speed limit then with those new procedures? And what is it?
Well, I don't know if we have the exact numbers in terms of written procedures. I don't know if you have.
You'd have to ask the City of Toronto. However, as Cathy mentioned, it's important to keep in mind that the master still does need some discretion as to the vessel approach speed if he needs to compensate for currents, winds, and such things. So it's not like an absolute number that, a speed limit. It's just that you have to be at such a speed that you can stop in time before you make contact with the dock.
Okay, the other thing that I'm a little curious about is, so the one propeller was not moving when this happened, and then it worked subsequently. I'm sure as a part of your investigation, you talked to the master to find out, did they try to apply that second propeller, and did they feel like it did not work? I know that there's a bit of a question as to whether or not there was a malfunction, but can the crew say whether or not they attempted to use both propellers and it didn't work, or what happened there?
So our witness interviews are protected on our hack, so I can't disclose any information that we received through interview or who indeed we interviewed. However, we do have evidence that the propeller was available to the crew and that they attempted to use it at that time.
Hi, we have a listener question from Joshua Freeman with CP24. Wonder if you could speak to the age and state of the vessel as it may pertain to the investigation. Would a more contemporary vessel design have helped mitigate any of the problems that were identified?
So the age of the vessel doesn't directly correlate to its mechanical reliability. Brand new vessels have mechanical failure as well. And that's why it's important to also have a solid and robust set of procedures to guide its operation, as well as crew training to fill in the gaps in the procedures and the mechanical issues.
Just following up on a question that was asked earlier. So the propeller was available to the operator of the vessel. You call that a captain, master?
The master, yes.
The master. It was available to him to use, but he did not use it. Was that pilot error?
I think it's important to look at the whole report. The report indicates that the crew attempted to use the forward throttle in conjunction with the aft throttle to slow the vessel prior to hitting the dock. However, it did not respond. The issue is that afterwards it did respond, and afterwards the sea trials demonstrated that they couldn't replicate what had happened at the time of the occurrence.
So it does sound like an possible equipment malfunction.
Well, I think what the investigator has said is that we couldn't confirm there was one, but nor could we confirm that there wasn't one.
Okay, and what would be considered a safe docking speed in knots for the Sam McBride carrying 900 people?
So as I said earlier, the safe docking speed is going to depend on the weather conditions at the time, the load of the vessel, and so on. Earlier that day, the vessel had performed safe dockings at speeds of around 3 to 3.5 knots.
Okay, we'll take
Is
one more question.
Is 5 knots safe?
Depending on the vessel's stopping distance.
Would it safe in that case on that day? Obviously not. or
We,
it wouldn't have been an accident,
we
right?
can follow up with you after. We'll be
Sorry.
available for interviews. We'll take one more question.
I'll answer the question. We can't give you that this is safe, that isn't safe. It depends on the conditions. All we can tell you is that if you look at the speeds that were in use earlier in the day, the vessel hadn't struck the dock in a way that caused passengers to be injured. At the higher speed and at the distance that they were when they tried to stop, the speed was such that with people standing on the stairs in particular, when the vessel struck the dock, they lost their footing, they fell, and that's why people were injured. But the precise speed, whether it should be 2, 3, 5, 8 knots, is very much a function of the conditions under which the vessel is operating on that day. So,
Can you tell us if the crew knew they were coming in too fast? And was there time to alert anybody, or was there an alert to any passengers from the master down to the other 5 that were working on the boat?
So from the when they passed the approach dolphins to the actual dock, there wasn't enough time for anybody to make a signal. No.
Okay, but what was the master aware, or was it kind of, were they caught by surprise when they hit?
The master was aware that he was going faster than usual. Yes.
But was he aware he was in trouble, like he might hit?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, but our spokespeople are available for interviews after. Nous allons prendre une petite pause, puis nous sommes disponibles pour des entrevues après. Merci d'être présent. Thank you for attending.